You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I am Paul Garner.
And I am Todd Wood.
And we've got another great episode lined up for you today. We'll come on to the topic in just a moment. We are so pleased with all the support that we've been receiving for the podcast. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure that you hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, so that you're notified of all of our new content, and do continue liking our episodes and sharing them with your friends. All of that is really great. We do appreciate it very much. Now, Todd, last episode, we were considering bad arguments.
Yeah.
And in particular, we were looking at arguments that creationists should not use. Arguments that rest on misunderstandings or on superseded information or errors of fact. All of those arguments that actually weaken our case rather than strengthen it. And we went through a whole list of arguments and had a look at them, examined them, and also looked at some principles about how we recognize bad arguments and why we should try and avoid them if possible. But what we thought we would do in this episode is kind of turn the tables a bit.
Yes.
And have a look at bad arguments by anti-creationists.
Right.
So the kinds of arguments that you and I are probably all too familiar with because we encounter them a lot, particularly on social media.
Mm-hmm.
Arguments that anti-creationists use, which we think are bad arguments, and that they would do well to avoid.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose, as we begin to think about it, I've got a few questions. Right. The first question I want to ask is, we're talking here about anti-creationists, but who do we mean? Who do we mean by anti-creationists?
Yeah. On the one level, I suppose on one level, it's kind of a continuum, right? There are evolutionists who are evolutionists, and they don't really much care about creationism. It's just this weird quackery fringe belief that they just don't care about. And so they don't really bother themselves with it. It doesn't really matter. And then you have the scientists who have had bad experiences with the creationists, maybe. And so they publish articles about why creationism is wrong. And they might have a website or a blog or a YouTube channel or whatever, trying to show this is why creationists are mistaken. But at the end of the day, it's still kind of a hobby for them. It's not a big deal. And then you've got the real extremists who hate creationists, and they've devoted many days and nights and much resources to arguing against creationists, and they're weird. But I think that about anti-evolutionists too, right? I think, I'm on one level an anti-evolutionist because I think it's wrong, and I don't really want to see people believing it, especially Christians, and I don't really want to see its continued success culturally. I'd rather see resources and things put toward more productive research, I think, and creation research. But other than that, I'm not going out of my way to bash evolution and tell people how stupid it is or anything like that. But you do have creationists who are like that, and they freak me out just as much as the really freaky anti-evolution, anti-creationist crowd. There's just these people who just are just angry and hateful, and they're gonna do everything they can to destroy us, and it's often awkward and unpleasant for most of the rest of humanity. It's the kind of person that you run into in the grocery store, and you turn around and go down the other row because you don't want to talk to them because the only thing they're going to talk about is that thing that they hate. So it's kind of all over the map. But generally speaking,
Yeah.
it's going to be someone who thinks, creationism is that weird thing that's always fighting court cases in the United States, and we should oppose their false views of science or whatever.
And they're also almost these kind of semi-professional stroke professional anti-creationists, who set up organizations.
Oh yeah.
National Center for Science Education,
Education,
or whatever it is.
Yeah,
And,
which is really the National Center for Evolution Advocacy. It's really not really that much about science education. They don't care about chemistry or physics or astronomy. Well, maybe astronomy to the extent that the universe is billions of years old. They'll pay attention to that. But it's mostly evolution advocacy. So.
Yeah. Although I think they've branched into climate change.
Right.
Recently.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure
kind of
they're going to have to branch into vaccines then too, as well, because
Yeah,
that's become a new hot topic of controversy. Do you have an NCSE over there in Britain?
There was a thing called the British Centre for Science Education that I think sort of had aspirations to model themselves on the NCSE, but they were actually a fairly ramshackle little group of angry internet atheists, mostly.
So it kind of fizzled.
So it kind of fizzled, and I think it looks as if it's pretty much sort of died out. So it's become extinct. And I think, it'd be fair to say that not everybody who's an anti-creationist is necessarily an angry atheist. There are Christians who are anti-creationists for various reasons. So we're not just talking about, angry internet keyboard warriors.
And they're not all angry. We should be fair. Right. They're not all angry.
Yeah.
Some of them are mystified. Some of them are puzzled. Some of them are embarrassed. There's a certain amount of anger, I think, in a lot of them, but it doesn't necessarily have to run their lives. And some of them are quite gracious and pleasant to talk to. They're not mean when you meet them in person. They're not mean. Yeah. You can have dinner with somebody and talk about things.
And some are much more thoughtful than others.
Yes.
So we do need to be fair about that. Now, I guess another question that's going to be in the minds of our listeners, perhaps, and viewers, is why should we advise the other side about arguments that they should avoid? Isn't it a strategy when you're kind of fighting a battle? Don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake.
I guess that's true. And, when someone makes a terrible argument against me or makes a snide comment about me, it's always very satisfying to sort of put them in their place, right? To say, actually, that's not true. And let me tell you about X, Y, and Z, and just sort of put them in their place. That's cute. But at the end of the day, I get so tired of hearing some of these things over and over again. Get a clue, people. Come on. And it's kind of the same as the sort of pro-creationist arguments that we talked about last time. Although there I have a lot more sympathy towards people because we're on the same side, and I just want you to be armed with good things rather than, your cardboard sword and and your paper shield. That's not going to do it. I want you to be armed with good stuff. So when the enemy is coming at me with their paper shield and cardboard sword, it just gets annoying. Just go away. It's just stop already. Give me something interesting to tackle with you, because this is not interesting. These same old arguments that are terrible. Ugh.
Yeah. I suppose to put it in a more positive way, if we want to promote more meaningful dialogue with people who disagree with us, we do want to actually get down to what are the real disagreements.
Yes.
And not spend time on silly straw man kind of
That's
issues.
right.
And so, we are interested in that. We are interested.
Very interested in that,
raising the level of the discussion and dialogue.
Yeah. Especially among Christians. I think we Christians owe each other certain love and respect as Jesus called us to. And not, and when we're not, being loving and kind towards those we disagree with, Jesus said the world would know us by our love for one another. And so what are they knowing about us when we're squabbling and bickering over creation? Mm-hmm. At least if we disagree about these things, we should do it well, right? And that means we should represent each other correctly and honestly and fairly. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess another question that might be in some people's minds as they listen to this discussion is, don't the other side just have bad arguments because they're wrong? So isn't that why their arguments are just bad?
Well, I mean, I think we've already answered that in a way last episode, right? When we tackled all the arguments creationists shouldn't use. That, by the way, all of those things we talked about last episode came right out of the AIG and CMI, the Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International lists. So this wasn't just us making up stuff to complain about. This was straight off of their list. So it's important, to be honest about our arguments. And just because they're wrong doesn't mean they have bad arguments. Some people can be sincerely and honestly mistaken about things because they didn't have all the facts, or maybe we've learned new things, like we did with the dead shark that we talked about last time. We learned new things, and I changed my opinion because that's not a plesiosaur, it's a dead shark. There you go.
And I think we just have to recognize that you can make a bad argument for a good idea.
Sure.
And you can actually make a good argument for a bad idea.
Yeah.
And, so it doesn't necessarily follow that their arguments are bad just because we think ultimately they're wrong about evolution.
Right.
So, So I think it's helpful for us to have a look at some of these arguments, the kinds of things that sort of frustrate us when we come across them.
Yeah.
And I've got a list here. We're just going to kind of work through this list, I think.
All right, sounds good.
The first one, I've got one or two things to say about this. The first one is no competent scientist rejects evolution.
Right. Which is to say, you are incompetent.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Oh, well, one of my favorite examples of this, I have a specific example where I heard this, was Richard Dawkins. Now, our listeners and viewers probably know who Richard Dawkins is. He probably has a lower profile today than he did at one time, when there was kind of the rise of the new atheist movement, and he had a lot of coverage. But Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist. He was an Oxford professor, very well known as sort of one of those prominent new atheists. And back in 2002, he was being interviewed on a BBC radio program called The Long View, and I listened in because this particular episode was all about creationism.
Oh no!
And in that program, Richard Dawkins said this, and I quote exactly. He said, "There are no reputable scientists who believe in creationism. That's one of the myths that creationists put about." Now, my question for Richard Dawkins would be, what do you mean by reputable scientists?
Yeah.
Because my suspicion is that this basically boils down to a complete tautology.
Yeah, that's
because
right.
any criterion that you can come up with for what makes a scientist reputable, do they have an earned PhD in a relevant discipline? Well, there are creationists that have earned PhDs in relevant disciplines to the origins debate. Are they someone who has a track record of actively researching in a field like biology or geology? Well, yeah, there are creationists who have done that. Do you mean someone with a track record of peer-reviewed publications in, reputable mainstream journals? Well, there are creationists who have a track record like that. So what do you mean by reputable scientists? And I suspect what Richard Dawkins would say is that reputable means somebody who accepts evolution.
Yes, that's right.
Which basically boils down to saying there are no reputable scientists who accept creationism, because if you're a reputable scientist, you reject creationism.
Yes.
That seems to me a fairly vacuous thing to say. It doesn't. It's pretty contentless. It doesn't have any substance to it as an argument.
Yeah.
So
you're right.
And you can even add, frustrates me about it.
In the United States, you can even add tenure track or a tenured professor at an accredited university or college. Mm-hmm. We have those too. All the sort of non-sectarian criteria or non-ideological criteria of what makes a person reputable or credible or competent. We got all that. And at the end of the day, when you say no competent scientist or no credible scientist or no reputable scientist believes creation, you could only be saying no, you might as well turn it around, right? No creationist is a reputable, credible scientist because they accept creationism, which is just an insult. That's all it is. Yeah. It's not. Yeah. It's not an argument. It's not a claim. It's an insult. Yeah. So let's just call it what it is. You're insulting us.
Yeah. And I suppose you could be more nuanced about this, because it's an absolutist statement. There are no reputable or competent scientists. Right. Well, you could say there are very few, or, these people are a tiny minority. Yes. And those statements would be true.
Yes, they would be true.
Those statements are true. But to simply say no competent scientist believes this stuff, that is not true. And it just seems to me a fairly sort of vacuous thing to say, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so no competent scientist rejects evolution. Now, here's another one. This is a favorite, and I'll throw this over to you and see what you have to say about it.
Okay.
Creationism is not scientific because it is not testable.
Oh, right. I can't put God in a test tube and get him to make another world so that I can observe what happens and therefore make it scientific. Alternatively, one might say, I recently read a book on the research involved in trying to figure out where life came from 4.5 billion years ago. And the author made the rather bold claim that appealing to God is no explanation at all, because where did God come from?
That's another Dawkins argument. That's straight out of his book, The God Delusion.
Yeah. And of course, that's not what God is, right? That's literally not following the definition of what God is as sort of the ultimate uncaused reality. At least that's part of what God is. He is not caused. He is outside of our universe entirely. He's something completely other, and he has no beginning. So that's the entity we're talking about when we say God created. So, but it's one of those. It's another one of those sorts of definitional kind of things, right? So we've decided, and it's common. You hear it all the time. Creationism, by definition, invokes the supernatural, so they cannot be scientific, which I find vacuous, like the last argument. So some examples can be given. So we talked about this back. We did a whole episode on what is science. And one of the things that we said in that episode was, and we'll link to that, by the way, in the show notes. One of the things that we said in that episode was that science doesn't really care where an idea comes from. It only cares whether it's something that's a claim about empirical reality that is amenable to testing. And if that's the case, then it can be tested, and it can be tested by science. And therefore, somehow that has entered the realm of science, the domain of science where science can operate. And it doesn't matter if your claim is that, car key gnomes always hide your car keys when you come in at night, and that's why you can't find them in the morning. Or whether your claim is that God made the universe.
Yeah.
Or whether your claim is that praying for people who are sick will help them to get better. Mm-hmm. That's a subject that appears in a surprising number of medical journals, where doctors have actually tried to test the effectiveness of intercessory prayer, where they would, they try to create double-blind experiments where the person praying doesn't personally know the person being prayed for, and the person who is sick, the pool of people who are sick, don't know whether they are being prayed for or not. And they find consistently the people who get prayed for tend to heal faster and more completely than those who don't. And that's in the medical literature. And there are people who complain that that's not really science and it's not good science, or we shouldn't publish that. And yet it's hard to argue. Yeah. It's designed just like any other medical study, of any sort of drug, where you're giving them either a placebo or the real drug and trying to decide whether the medicine actually helps someone. It's designed exactly the same way. And so it's clearly part of science. So I would say it's just not, it doesn't make sense to say a priori, as a matter of principle, that supernatural things cannot be science and cannot be tested by science. Now, in the area of creation, we can give some examples there as well. I mean, we can, certainly the 7-day creation described in Genesis 1, I don't think that is really a testable thing. I don't think, I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to box myself in, but the actual events of the first week of creation, I don't think we could figure that out and test that from science. Yeah. But the idea that plants and swimming things and flying things and beasts of the field and livestock and human beings all had separate origins. Now that might be something that we could imagine devising a test for, sure, and trying to research on. And so it all depends on what the actual claim is. Same with the flood, right? So to say there was once a flood in the days of Noah and only the people on Noah's Ark survived it. The existence of Noah's Ark, the existence of Noah, that might be something that we have to just sort of take by faith. But the idea that there was a global flood that caused a lot of damage, that might be something, if you said what kind of damage it did, you might be able to test for that or not, which is, I think, the basis of flood geology. So, we understand, we creationists understand that there are certain claims that we're making that are really not amenable to scientific testing, that we take on faith as being revelations from God, that God has told us this is what happened. And there are other aspects of what God tells us then that turn into things that we could actually test. If what this verse says means X, then we could have devised a test for X. And once that's happened, we've entered the realm of science, and it doesn't really matter where that idea came from. If it came from Buddhism or Islam or Mormonism, we could test. If it's a claim about the natural world that's testable, then it's a scientific claim. And it doesn't matter if it's in the Quran or the Book of Mormon or the Bible. It just doesn't matter. Yeah. Science does not care about that.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there are claims that creationists make which are not scientifically useful claims. We claim that God exists and that God made everything, but in themselves, those statements are not very useful to us scientifically. But if we can begin to formulate more precise statements and formulate specific hypotheses that we can then, that make predictions that we can then go out and test against the data. So, for example, what is the status of a particular hominin fossil, or what is the origin of this particular rock formation?
Right.
Well, then those things are amenable to scientific testing.
Yeah.
And actually, that it's not all that much different from evolutionary claims in that sense, because there are evolutionary claims that are just too vague to be scientifically useful. If I just said, life evolved, well, okay, but how do I test that? Well, the only way I can test that is by starting to formulate precise statements about the origin of particular biological traits or about particular biological processes that I can then go and test. So I don't think it's actually, all that different, really. And the fact that critics of creationism, and I've got an example here. So here we've got a book just off my bookcase here. In the beginning, A Scientist Shows Why the Creationists Are Wrong by Chris McGowan.
Right.
Well,
right. I was just thinking that.
If you can provide evidence, scientific evidence against creationism, that is a tacit acknowledgement that creationists are making claims which are scientific claims that can be tested. Now, you might come to the conclusion, well, creationism is lousy science, it's bad science.
Sure.
Although that then opens the possibility that, well, we can do something to fix it. We can make good science.
Yes, we could do good science.
But
and maybe we already are.
But you can't write books like this and at the same time say that creationism is non-scientific by definition because you can't test it. Yep. These are mutually incompatible
exclusive
claims. So I think people have got to make a choice. If they want to say creationism isn't testable, then quit writing books like this. Right? But if it is scientifically testable, then it is legitimately within the purview of science.
Exactly.
It has to be evaluated the same way. So, yeah. I think you're right. What people are really, I think, sort of getting at when they say this is they've got to be in their bonnet about supernatural causation.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Sure.
And like you say, supernatural causation does not become a science showstopper if you can, even if you can't actually investigate, let's say, the miracle or the miracle causing agent. Even if you can't directly investigate God or what he actually did, if what he did has effects in the natural world that you can then investigate, then you can begin to study it scientifically.
Right.
And like you say, studies of intercessory prayer, studies that are published evaluating what is the origin of the Shroud of Turin, studies about parapsychological claims. These are studies that investigate supernatural or paranormal claims, and they get published in the mainstream literature. And
yeah, they do.
I don't see how creationism can be, ruled out and something different from that. We can test it the same way, provided we make the right kinds of, precise claims and formulate specific hypotheses. So there we are. So that's that one. Anything else we want to say on that?
No,
I think we've done that to death, haven't we?
I think that, like you say, there's a nuanced way of approaching that, and that would be, insofar as creationists make scientific claims, they're not very good, or they're lousy, or they've been proven wrong. That would be an anti-creationist argument that I would say, okay, well, at least we can evaluate that. We can talk about that. We can have a discussion about whether that's true or not. But when you just when you just say it's not science, period. Come on. You know that's not right, because you're about to give me a list of all the scientific reasons why creationism is wrong. Right. It must be science on some level. So
yeah. Kind of related to all of this so far is the claim that you young Earth creationists, you just don't publish in mainstream journals. You know, if you had anything worthwhile to say scientifically, you would go and get it published in a peer-reviewed, reputable journal, and perhaps even, you know, you could just publish your case for creationism in Nature, and, you know, stand back and pick up your Nobel Prize, right? You know, this is how science works, right? So, you know, why don't you do that?
Yeah. Where do we begin?
Where do we begin?
On the one hand, I think there is some measure of truth to that. This is one of the reasons we have our own creationist journals.
Right.
Because if we tried to write a paper on created kinds or on flood geology, we would not be able to publish that in a geological journal. And some of the reason for that is, I think, ideological, right? They don't do real science, so we're not publishing this gibberish. But also, I think there's a certain matter of creationism is sort of a diamond in the rough. We're still shaping and forming things, and there are unanswered questions, right? So if we had to meet the peer review standard of an atheistic scientist, it would be impossible at this stage, I think, because they would want a fully formed, fully fledged, complete model that explains everything. And creationism is not quite there yet. That doesn't mean that we don't do good science. But on the other hand, Paul, I think you and I both know the central claim is actually not correct.
Right.
I think you and I are both examples of scientists who have published papers in mainstream scientific journals that have implications for creation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so...
And we know lots of other creationists.
We do.
Who
have done the same
description.
Yeah.
And we are not going to give you a list and name them, because many of them are just wanting to kind of go about their scientific career without having some crazy anti-creationist make life difficult for them. But you're right. It is not true to say that creationists do not publish in mainstream journals. Now, the kind of rejoinder that I've often had when I've said that to people is they say, well, yeah, sure, you get creationists who publish in mainstream journals, but what they're publishing has nothing to do with their creationism. It's kind of some other topic that they're researching. That is also not true.
That is also not true.
Not in the slightest.
Right.
Sure, you know, some creationists publish in other areas that are not specifically related to the origins question.
That's correct.
True. But a lot of what creationists do publish in the peer-reviewed mainstream literature directly arises from their creationist concerns. It's motivated by their interest in developing and building the creationist model. And sometimes it's even funded by creationist organizations. So to say that this has nothing to do with their creationism, I just think is, but it's not true.
Should we give an example? I volunteer to give an example. How about
Go on.
We won't put you on the spot. But I don't know, about a decade ago, there was a researcher named Phil Center. And Phil was on this mad spree of publishing a bunch of anti-creationist papers. And to his credit, most of them were pretty clever. I really enjoyed reading what he had to say and what he was doing. And so I thought his work was kind of helpful. And then he published a paper about baraminology, which is my thing. That's what I do, baraminology, in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology. And so I thought, on a lark, what the hey, I'll write a response. So I wrote a paper responding to him and his claims in that journal. And I sent it to the editor. And this was a case, I think, where the editor and the reviewer didn't really understand who I was and what I was doing. And they didn't really, I think they probably would have been a lot more hard on me had they understood what was happening. My paper was a masterpiece of third-person narrative. Maybe a creationist might say this, which was really code word for, I'm saying this. So somehow the thing got published. And then Phil wrote a rejoinder and argued, that I was wrong again, which is fine. Also published in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology. And then I tried to write another response, but at that point the editor had changed hands. The editorship had changed hands. There was a new editor, and he basically said, I'm not going to publish any more of this. You're done. You're out. And that was that. Was it earth-shattering? No. But it was published in a mainstream, real evolutionary biology journal, and it's baraminology, and there you go. It's out there. So it's not correct to say that that we never publish. It's hard. I will grant you that. A lot of it's ideological, because you got a lot of people who are just horrified by the idea that a creationist could possibly publish in their journal. That would be the end of the universe. But it happens.
And some of the papers that get published are directly related, as I say, to the creationist interests of the authors.
Yeah.
It is effectively creationist research.
It is.
But in the paper, the researcher might not explicitly spell out what the creationist implications are, because, as you say, that's going to be a red flag to a reviewer.
Yeah.
Because you have to remember that the scientific community and the journal editors are operating, by and large, within a kind of naturalistic framework. And so if you start talking about flood geology or created kinds or something like that, then, you're that's a recipe to get your paper rejected.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, there are, if you're careful about it and you stick to what you did and what the data show, without drawing too many, perhaps explicitly creationist conclusions, then that kind of work is eminently publishable.
Yeah.
And a lot of it does get published. I think we would want to encourage more creationists to do that. Submit to mainstream journals, because I think a lot of creationists just don't bother because they've heard the horror stories. And, we both know that there are cases where, papers have been unfairly rejected because people just know that the author is a creationist. And we know that some creationists, perhaps because they have a higher profile than others, find it harder to get published in those kinds of forums. But I think, where possible, where it's possible to sort of be an active participant in the wider scientific community, we should try to do it. We want to encourage people to do that without being naive about the challenges that are involved. And hopefully, that in a sense, because we have a higher hurdle to get over because we're creationists very often, maybe that drives us to higher standards of scientific work.
Right.
Mm-hmm. You would hope that was the case. So that kind of, and we haven't talked about it, but it sort of leads into a whole discussion about peer review, which we need to have sometime, perhaps, as part of the podcast. The value of peer review and the challenges of peer review. Yeah. Because I think so often what happens is people just sort of elevate peer review to to this status that it doesn't kind of deserve. Peer review is important. We are advocates of peer review because it is important in maintaining quality and correcting mistakes and filtering out poor research. But peer review alone doesn't guarantee quality or legitimacy. We know that there are examples of bad research that gets through peer review and good research that gets rejected by peer review. And there are all kinds of other problems. But that's kind of a bigger discussion, perhaps for another day. We need to, we should talk about peer review. But let's just realize that peer review is not a panacea. It's not kind of a solution. And also remember that a huge number of scientific discoveries of the past never went through anything like modern peer review.
Right.
Modern peer review, that it is essentially a fairly modern phenomenon.
Right. It is.
And so let's not sort of give it a status that it doesn't deserve. Let's recognize its value, but not over egg the pudding. So, moving on. Here's an interesting one. And I've come across this recently. If the Earth is young, as creationists say it is, why does it look old? So, you want me to kick off with this one? Because I find this an intriguing objection.
Why don't you tackle that one? If the Earth is young, why does it look old?
Why does it look old? And I think there are lots of things to say here. I suppose my first reaction is to say, well, even within the creationist model, the Earth is old.
It is quite
6,000 years old is quite a long time, and we can forget just how long 6,000 years really is. But I guess what people are really meaning is it looks millions of years old, or hundreds of millions of years old. As I think about this, the question that is always in the forefront of my mind is, what would a young world look like?
Yeah.
Because I think the question sort of presupposes that the answer to that is obvious. And I'm not sure that it's at all straightforward or obvious. So think about the world as it was, assuming the creationist position. Think about the world as it was when God first made it. So there would have been continents and oceans. There were plants growing on the land. Mm-hmm. There were animals in the seas and in the air and on the land. There were people, Adam and Eve, in the garden. And then ask yourself the question, okay, so what was the rock that made up the ocean floor?
What would that look like?
Was it basalt, like today? And if it was, that would look like it had crystallized from a magma, but maybe God created it. What about the rock that makes up the continents? What kind of rock was that? Was it granite, which again would look like it had crystallized from a cooling magma? Was it gneiss or schist, which would be a metamorphic rock? It would look like it had some sort of precursor that had been pressure cooked. Or was it perhaps a sedimentary rock? Was it a sandstone made of mineral grains that looked as if they'd been sourced by erosion from somewhere else? What was the rock that Adam was standing on? And in any conceivable answer to that question, I think you automatically have something that looks as if it has a history.
Yeah.
That looks as if it has an appearance of age.
Yeah.
What were the plants growing in? Presumably they were growing in some kind of soil. Mm-hmm. But what did that soil look like? What did it contain? What was its structure and texture? Did it grade down into uneroded bedrock, for example? Mm-hmm. What about the plants themselves? The classic question is, if you'd cut down a tree in the Garden of Eden, would it have had growth rings in it? Adam and Eve, they looked Yeah, did they have a belly button? They looked like mature adults. And the old question that Goss asked, did Adam have a navel?
Right.
If he didn't have a natural birth. So it seems to me that however you cut it, a created, functioning young world is going to have features in it that look as though they have a history, that look old, even if they are not. It's just difficult. I can't conceive it could be any other way.
Yeah.
And then I think about the miracles of Christ in the New Testament, and I kind of see something similar. So take, for example, when Christ fed the 5,000, with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. As Christ performed that miracle, I mean, presumably a great quantity of bread and fish was created, enough to feed the multitude and then have 12 basketfuls left over.
Right.
And what would a scientist have seen if you were a scientist and you could have got a sample of the leftovers from the basket, and you took it back to your laboratory? What would you have found? I mean, presumably this bread. Yeah. This bread bread has a history, right? It comes from grain, which was a growing crop that was ground down to produce flour and mixed with other ingredients and then put in a hot oven. And that's how you make bread. And presumably this bread that the multitudes ate, that Christ had created, looked like bread like that. As a geologist, I'm kind of worried about created metamorphic rocks. Well, this is bread that's been in an oven. That's what it looks like. But it didn't have that history. The fishes, I was thinking about the fishes. Presumably they look just like the fishes that are spawning in the rivers and lakes. But these were created fish.
And it was cooked. It cooked. He didn't just slap people with an entire dead fish. It was probably, cleaned and cooked.
Yeah.
For them to eat.
And some fish, they have little ear bones called otoliths that have growth lines in them. And you can count the growth lines and tell how old the fish is. Well, I mean, did those created fish have growth lines in their ear bones? I don't know. But I just think that, if you were able to analyze the leftovers in those baskets on that occasion, and you didn't know about the miracle that Christ had just performed, you may well come to completely incorrect conclusions about the age of those things. So I think there's all of that. And then, of course, we've been talking about this sort of mature functioning creation, but overlaid on all of that, we've then got the effects of the flood.
Yeah.
Because the Bible tells us that there was a worldwide flood in the days of Noah, and presumably this worldwide flood is going to accomplish a huge amount of geological work in a short space of time. Geological work that, if we were just going on process rates operating today, you would say, well, those processes must have taken a long period of time. But actually, they didn't take a long period of time. They were accelerated during the flood. So taking all of that into account, the maturity of the creation, the effects of the global flood in the days of Noah, I just think it's inevitable that we're going to look at aspects of this created world. And if we don't take into account the revelation of God in the Bible that tells us what God did, we will look at those things and come to incorrect conclusions about age. Mm-hmm. I just can't see how it can be any other way.
Yeah.
So those are just a few thoughts.
Let me react to that then. So a couple of thoughts on this. One would be, I've noticed an increasing hostility towards what you've called here the appearance of age, an increasing maybe frustration with it. And I want to say very clearly, there is a history of this planet, thousands of years that this planet has been here, and there has been a real history to it. Creationism does not claim, we do not claim, that the earth was created the way you see it now.
Yeah.
That's not part of what we're saying. What we're simply saying is, it is inconceivable to imagine a creation of a real planet like ours in a way that doesn't look like it's been sitting there a while. It's just, I can't, like Paul said, what would a created rock look like if God came and created a piece of granite, or Jesus, multiplied the loaves and fish? How would you be able to tell between the thing that was just created and the thing that had an actual history? I don't know. Right? So this is kind of a philosophical point that wraps into then the actual history. And so some of the evidence of antiquity of the earth is a result of the real history of the planet. And I think what we're going to find as we get into this, going back to our intermittent series on radiometric dating, that's one of those examples. I would not use an appearance of age argument to explain radiometric dating. It's not going to work. Because that would entail God creating the entire planet basically as we find it, with all the fossils in the fossil record intact, implying a history of creatures on this planet that never existed and that sort of thing. I don't think that works. And I don't know that there is any creationist out there who's going to make that argument. So don't try to take the appearance of age argument more than what it is. We are not saying there is no history. We're simply saying that any point of creation entails what appears to be a history.
And nor are we saying that there aren't evidences of youth in the creation as well.
That's right.
Because there are aspects of the creation that look young.
Yes.
For example, the generally low intensity of animal burrowing in most sedimentary rock layers is most consistent with the young age model and not with the old age model.
That's right.
And that's because those sedimentary rocks, we think, were formed during the flood and in the short time since the flood. And so there are going to be, I think the picture's going to be mixed. There are going to be some things that look old if we assume kind of just naturalistic processes. And there are going to be other things that look young. And I think this is why there is a certain ambiguity about the creation that we observe. I say ambiguity. It's ambiguous, I think, particularly if we ignore the revelation of God in Scripture.
That's right.
I think if we refuse to take seriously what God has actually told us He did, then I think we could well come to incorrect conclusions, but actually conclusions that would be somewhat reasonable, taking into account just the physical evidence. So it's a complex question, and I just think the problem I have, with that objection, is that it assumes too much, that it's actually that we know what a young world would look like, and that it would clearly be different from a world that had a very ancient history. And I just think that actually it's such a complex, multifaceted question that it's not a good objection. It's a difficult question. It's an intriguing question. But I don't think it's a kind of knockdown argument against creationism.
Right.
We've probably said enough about that. Now, here's one for a biologist. So I'm going to throw this over to you, at least to begin with. And again, it's one that comes up. Well, I've heard it lots, and it's to do with the idea that some things in the creation are badly or poorly designed. And
right.
The specific example is the vertebrate eye.
Sure.
And the claim is that the vertebrate eye is wired backwards in a way that no designer, no intelligent creator would possibly do it. So, yeah. What do you think about that, Todd?
Yeah, I mean, that's, like you say, that goes to many, many different facets of creation. We could talk about why do we have wisdom teeth when they don't fit in our jaws? Why are our backs curved the way they are, which makes us prone to herniating our discs and giving us terrible back pain? Why? Yeah, and it goes on and on and on. You know, if I were a designer, I would know how to design a better system than this. And it's just a stupidly presumptuous argument on the one level. You're basically saying, I know what God was trying to do with this design, and I know objectively it could have been done better. Yeah. And I don't even, better for what? Better for seeing? With my glasses, I have fine 20/20 vision. And my glasses have nothing to do with my retina. They have everything to do with my lenses. So that's dumb. I mean, I don't have any problem. And I would say most creatures who have their retinas wired the way we do, vertebrates, do not have this kind. They don't suffer from that alleged deficiency. It does not seem to be a bad design at all. So that's just, it's just on the one level sort of stupidly silly. It's clearly not a bad design because it works. And who's to say why this is designed the way it is? It's just weird. Right. Yeah.
It's a philosophical argument.
Yeah.
About that kind of presumes you know what God would do.
Yeah.
But also biology is full of compromise because that's just the way that biology functions.
Yes.
If you think of a bivalve, a shellfish of some kind, it has a shell that protects it. And you could imagine a shell that was more efficient at protecting the organism. You could make the shell, 2 feet thick.
Sure.
But that's not going to be good for some other things, right?
Nope. It'd be too heavy to move. Right. Yeah. It's
exactly. Exactly. You can't move around. So these things are always going to be balances and compromises, sort of different needs of the organism are going to be, balanced in this way.
And I think every real designer, every real engineer understands that any design has got to be a trade-off between issues like function and safety and efficiency. And you can't
and beauty.
Yeah, and beauty.
And beauty.
You cannot optimize everything to the perfect level of optimality. There's, any design is going to be a trade-off, like you say, of what you're trying to accomplish. So it doesn't surprise me that, you look into living creatures and you find things that look a little weird and you think, well, what's this about? That's the way it goes. That's just how it is.
And actually, it's not all that clear that the vertebrate eye is not a good design.
Right.
Because the idea is, no self-respecting designer is going to do it like this. Actually, there are good functional reasons, I think, for, why the eye might be wired with the neural network in front of the retina. You read the literature and you realize that the photoreceptors at the back of the eye, the rods and the cones, they've got to be in intimate contact with this thing called the choroid layer for nutrients and oxygen and some other vital sort of molecules that it needs. And like you say, it's not clear that having the nerves there in front actually compromises vision too much, particularly because there was this paper published a few years ago where I think it was scientists in Leipzig, they were describing these things called Muller cells, which in effect collect and funnel the light through the neural layer towards the photoreceptors.
Nice.
And they're designed like optic cables. They're
fiber
like
optics, yeah.
They're like fiber optics. And you think, well, wow, that's a fantastic design. And,
It is.
Any disadvantage of having the neural network there is probably compensated by having these incredible Muller cells. So, yeah, it doesn't strike me as a particularly powerful or cogent argument.
And it's a kind of a tedious one. I think the more interesting argument is, things like, why did God make rattlesnakes? Or why did God make HIV or monkeypox? Whatever the disease of the day is. why is that, right? That's a far more interesting question and much more complicated. So if you're going to be an anti-creationist, please ask those kinds of questions, because that will stop us in our tracks and make us go, oh, that's a good question. Whereas just saying, oh, this is dumb design, that just makes you look dumb.
Okay, I've got one more objection
It'll
on
be
my list.
Probably our last one, I guess.
This will be the last one. And this is a fascinating one. And at some point, we ought to have a biblical scholar on and talk about some of these questions a bit more. The objection goes like this. Look, you creationists take the Bible literally. So if you're reading the Bible literally, why don't you also accept the three-tiered cosmos that the Bible describes, as well as six-day creation?
Yeah. And the claim being that the Bible teaches that the cosmos is organized by a flat disk, which is the earth, a hard dome, which is the heavens, and that the sun moves around in this hard dome. And the earth is the center of everything. And that down is the underworld, and beyond the universe is waters of chaos.
Yeah. And there are literal windows in this
literal
solid dome
windows
through which the rain comes.
Through which the rain falls, Well, first of all, the premise being, because you read the Bible literally, I'm not sure that that's true. I think there's a large portion of the Bible, and I'm not exactly sure, it may be a majority, but it's certainly 45%, that is written in a poetic form that is clearly not intended to be taken literally. So I don't, right? I don't read that literally. Now, others would argue for a more classical definition of literal, which means including figures of speech and things like that, and genre questions and that sort of thing. And I'll grant you that. But when we say it in the modern world, literally usually means woodenly stuck on, sort of taking figures of speech literally. So if I say something is cool, then I must mean it has a lower temperature than I do. No, that is not what it means. And I know that. And I'm not being a literalist when I use the word cool. I mean, I'm not, I can still, in a classical sense of literal, use the word cool to describe things and not mean a lower temperature. So on the one level, I think it's a kind of a silly argument. On the other level, I think that it's not what the Bible teaches. And this is tricky.
Yeah.
Because I can see how you could read Genesis 1 and make it fit with that vision of the universe. But Genesis, and in fact the rest of the Bible, does not tell us what the structure of the cosmos is. There are other religious myths and documents from the ancient Near East that do try to describe this explicitly. But the Bible is not one that does. So to say that the Bible teaches this is false. Yeah. The Bible does not spell it out.
I think that's a really important point, because I think, and I've seen this sort of argument expounded at greater length. But the language that's used in the Bible, whenever the structure of the cosmos might be potentially touched upon, seems equivocal.
Yes, it does. Intentionally.
I think that's deliberate. I think it's deliberate, so that an ancient reader who perhaps had a particular outmoded view of the cosmos could read the text and not at all be disturbed by it.
Nope.
Whereas we, with our modern conception of the cosmos, can read the same text and we equally are not disturbed by it, or we shouldn't be, because the language is deliberately ambiguous.
Yes.
It's not telling us anything about the structure of the cosmos, which, I think is different than the clear statements in narrative, in historical passages, from which we derive many of our creationist convictions. We are not talking about a few ambiguous references in figurative and poetic passages. We're talking about statements in the New Testament about, there being one man who introduced sin and death to the cosmos. Those are clear statements of historical import. And I just don't see them as equivalent in any sense.
And read through Genesis 7 and notice how many different ways the author is telling you that the flood covered everything. It's a fascinating read because he's using different words, he's using different phrases and different concepts, and he keeps repeating it and repeating it and repeating it with these multiple different ways. And it's almost like he knows you're not going to believe this, so I better explain it in every way conceivable so you don't mistake what I'm trying to say. That's very different than saying, like in the Psalms, it says there's a passage that talks about the earth is established and it shall not be moved. And that sounds pretty impressive. Like, the earth couldn't possibly be going around the sun, unless you look at the word move in Hebrew and you realize it's used in a much looser way than absolute motion. It's also used for the feet of the righteous in one passage. The feet of the righteous shall not be moved. Well, that doesn't mean that my feet are stuck in one place. That just means that they're not going to get knocked away from where God wants me to be. And I think that's exactly right. So the language there is, as you say, utterly ambiguous. It could apply to a geostationary world where the earth is stuck and literally cannot move. It could also apply to our planet that orbits the sun and rotates every day. It just, the wording there doesn't matter. And I think you're right. I think that Genesis is written exactly in that way so that the ancient person who thinks the cosmos is set up that way wouldn't even bat an eyelash at what he's reading there. But the modern person who thinks something completely different about the cosmos would read it and go, that's interesting, and not even bat an eyelash. It's only when you're trying to sort of force the ancient conceptions, some ancient conceptions, not all, some ancient conceptions, into what the scripture actually says, and then maybe make the false claim that the Bible teaches it, that it goes off in the weeds, and you're definitely wrong.
Yeah. I read a very interesting paper that was published in 2011 by two biblical scholars called The Myth of the Solid Heavenly Dome. And that was a very interesting paper, and I think it would be worth us sort of linking to that in the show notes.
Yes.
So we will do that. Well, that kind of takes me through our list, and there's so much more that could be said on each of those, and many more arguments that should be avoided that we haven't covered in this short series of 2 episodes. Maybe we'll come back to it sometime if people find this helpful. But anyway, for now, that's it. We'll wrap up. We don't know what's coming next because we haven't decided yet. So be back in a couple of weeks to find out. Remember that all of our streaming platforms and show notes can be found at coursesci.org coursesci.org/podcast. coursesci.org/podcast. We love getting your questions and comments, so keep those coming in, and you can email us at podcast@coursesci.org. Remember to keep liking and sharing our episodes. Tell your friends, spread the word. And if you haven't already subscribed, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you're on some other streaming platform other than YouTube, leave us a positive review. As we always say at the end of each of our episodes, we are only able to keep this content coming and doing all of the other things that we do because of the support of people like yourselves who want to support us. And so I'd encourage you to check out both of our websites and consider leaving a donation. Biblical Creation Trust is the organization that I work for. We're based in the UK. We have a website at biblicalcreationtrust.org, and you can click on our donate button on the homepage and it will tell you about all of the ways that you can give to the work of Biblical Creation Trust. Todd, how would people give to Core Academy of Science?
All right, Core Academy of Science. You can find us on the web at coresci.org/connect. And there you will find links to our website and other important content that we want you to know about, including all of our social media presence. And if you would like to make a contribution towards the production of this series and this show, we would love that. Why don't you check out coresci.org/donate, where you'll find links. You'll find our address. You can send us a check. You can find our PayPal account where you can PayPal us money. Shoot, if you see me in church, you can slip me $20. That'd be fine too. It's all good. We'll put it all towards the production and the work of Core Academy, production of this podcast.
That's great. Do check out both of the websites. Do consider leaving us a donation. And we hope that we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time for whatever topic we're going to be covering then. I'm sure it'll be fun.
All right. See you then.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.